Hello, a very good afternoon and welcome to the News International edition on this 28th day of March 2023. We are coming to you live from our Vision Group headquarters here in Kampala, Uganda. I'm Emma Akwero. Our top story is the latest coming from Kenya's protests. Opposition leader Raila Odinga has said the Monday protests are legal and that the police chief Japhet Koma has no authority to halt them. Koma on Sunday announced a ban on the planned protests, but Azimio supporters yesterday went on with the demonstration, which they say the constitution allows. We have details.
Kenyan police fired tear gas at protesters as they pressed ahead with anti-government demonstrations despite a ban. The protesters defied a warning by the Inspector General of Police that the demonstrations are illegal. Police clashed with stone-throwing demonstrators in Nairobi's largest slum, Kibera, where protesters set tires on fire. In another slum, Mathare, protesters also faced off against police as residents ran for cover. A young man was shot dead on Monday as the anti-government protests turned increasingly violent, with police firing tear gas at opposition leader Raila Odinga's convoy and his supporters, and looters going on the rampage. The veteran politician has called for regular protests every Monday and Thursday, accusing President William Ruto of stealing last year's election and of failing to control the surging cost of living. Police deployed tear gas in Nairobi and Kisumu to disperse crowds, firing canisters at cars carrying journalists in the capital. Officers also used tear gas and water cannon as Odinga's convoy moved through a congested neighborhood in Nairobi. Hundreds of looters descended on former President Uhuru Kenyatta's vast farm on the outskirts of Nairobi, stealing sheep and cutting trees before setting a section of the property on fire. Kenyatta backed Odinga's candidacy in the presidential poll in August last year after falling out with his former deputy William Ruto. 31 officers were injured in last week's running battles between riot police and demonstrators, and more than 200 people were arrested, including several senior opposition politicians. The demonstrations are the first major outbreak of political unrest since Ruto took office more than 6 months ago. Many Kenyans are struggling to put food on the table, battling high prices for basic goods, as well as a plunging local currency and a record drought that has left millions hungry. During the election campaign, Ruto portrayed himself as a champion of the downtrodden and vowed to improve the lot of ordinary Kenyans. But critics say he has broken several campaign promises and has removed subsidies from fuel and maize flour, a dietary staple. Kenya's energy regulatory body has also announced a hike in electricity prices from April, despite Ruto insisting in January there would be no such increase. Last week's protests proved costly, with Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua saying the economy had lost at least $15 million.
And the latest coming from Israel is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has paused a judicial overhaul that triggered a general strike, political division and mass protests in the country's most severe domestic crisis in years. The proposed reforms would curtail the authority of the Supreme Court and give politicians greater powers over the selection of judges. After nearly 3 months of increasing tensions, the legislation will now be considered further in the next session of Parliament, which begins in the second half of April.
I say here and now there can be no civil war. Israeli society is on a dangerous collision course. We are in the midst of a crisis that is endangering the basic unity between us. This crisis requires all of us to act responsibly. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's comments came a day after he sacked his defense minister Yoav Gallant, who had cited national security concerns in calling for a halt to the legislative process. Earlier on Monday, President Isaac Herzog, who holds a largely ceremonial role, made a similar demand, and tens of thousands of protesters had rallied near Parliament in Jerusalem after the strike declaration. Flights were disrupted, hospitals stopped, non-emergency services, and even diplomats walked off the job. But immediately after Netanyahu announced the pause, Einon Bar David, the chairperson of the Histad Root Trade Union Confederation, called off the strike. About 80,000 demonstrators joined the Jerusalem rally, Israeli media estimated. A nearby counter-demonstration attracted thousands of right-wing backers of the overhaul. His far-right Jewish Power Party revealed on Monday that the decision to delay the legislation involved an agreement to expand the minister's portfolio after he threatened to quit if the overhaul was put on hold.
אני ער למתח העצום שהולך ונצבר בין שני המחנות, בין שני חלקי העם.
I'm aware of the enormous tension that is building between the two sides, between two parts of the nation, and I'm attentive to the desire of many citizens to dispel this tension. However, there is one thing that I cannot accept. There is an extremist minority that is prepared to tear our country to pieces. The judicial proposals have sparked concern from Israel's allies, including the United States, and Washington welcomed Netanyahu's pause as an opportunity to create additional time and space for compromise. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid says he's ready to engage in dialogue over the proposed changes if the legislation totally stops. Demonstrators have for months decried the reform plans as a threat to Israel's democracy. The proposed reforms would curtail the authority of the Supreme Court and give politicians greater powers over the selection of judges. Figures from Israel's economically important high-tech sector have played a key role in the protests, and some analysts say uncertainties related to the reforms have already triggered economic decline. The government, a coalition between Netanyahu's Likud party and extreme right and ultra-Orthodox Jewish allies, argues the changes are needed to rebalance powers between lawmakers and the judiciary. According to Lapid, the government has undergone a hostile takeover by a messianic, nationalist and anti-democratic group. Lawmakers were scheduled to vote this week on a central part of the proposals which would change the way judges are appointed. A parliamentary committee has already amended the draft law to make it more acceptable to opponents, but the opposition ruled out backing any part of the reform until there is a pause in all legislative steps. Netanyahu last week vowed to responsibly advance the reforms and end the rift they have caused. In response, the Attorney General on Friday accused him of illegal public intervention in the process, citing potential conflict of interests due to his ongoing trial. The Premier is facing charges of bribery, fraud and breach of trust, which he denies.
Away from Israel, new demonstrations have erupted in France as the outgoing Secretary General of the CGT Union, Philippe Martinez, calls on the government to initiate mediation to find a solution to the social crisis caused by the pension reform. French police have come under severe criticism for the heavy-handed handling of the protesters.
Fresh strikes and protests have gripped France, with a record number of police deployed as President Emmanuel Macron remains defiant over a pensions reform that is sparking turmoil all over the country. The day of action is the 10th since protests began in mid-January against the law, which includes raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Last Thursday saw the most violent clashes yet between protesters and security forces as tensions erupted into pitched battles on the streets of Paris, and police reported 457 arrests across France and injuries to 441 officers. The outgoing Secretary General of the CGT Union, Philippe Martinez, is calling on the government to initiate mediation to find a solution to the social crisis caused by the pension reform.
Compte tenu de la mobilisation qui ne faiblit pas, comme on l'a décidé en intersyndicale.
In view of the mobilization, which is not weakening, as we decided in the inter-union meeting, we proposed once again to the government and especially to the President of the Republic to suspend his project and to appoint a mediator. As in any social conflict in companies, when there is a conflict that lasts, we try to find a solution on subjects that are more topical than ever. Nearly 2 weeks after Macron rammed the new pensions law through Parliament using a special provision skipping a vote in the lower house, Unions have vowed no let-up in mass protests to get the government to back down. A state visit to France by Britain's King Charles III, which had been due to begin on Sunday, was postponed because of the unrest. Macron on Monday instead met Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, other cabinet ministers and senior lawmakers for crisis talks at the Élysée Palais. In a conciliatory gesture, Borne has scheduled talks over 3 weeks with members of parliament, political parties and local authorities, while still hoping to meet union leaders. She's expected to offer worker representatives new measures designed to ease the impact of the pensions law, targeting physically demanding jobs, conditions for older workers and retraining. But early reactions were not promising for the Prime Minister.
Le problème, c'est toujours le même depuis 2 mois, enfin plus même maintenant, c'est un gouvernement et un président.
The problem has been the same for 2 months or even longer now. It's a government or at least a president of the republic now who is, it seems to me, quite isolated, who decides in the place of millions of people that they have to work 2 years more. And when we talk to those who work, I was talking to a fireman this morning on a picket line who said to me, but can you imagine me at 64 years old on top of the ladder to save lives? If I'm not in a condition to do my job properly, lives are at stake. Protesters in Nantes, western France, have blocked access roads to the city, creating 45 kilometers of congestion. Mass transit in Paris is heavily affected, with traffic both on metros and suburban trains disrupted. Rubbish collectors in the capital are continuing their strike, with close to 8,000 tons of garbage piled up in the streets as of Sunday. About 15% of service stations in France are short of petrol because of refinery strikes. France's Civil Aviation Authority has advised airlines to cut some of their scheduled flights for the rest of the week. The French industrial action comes a day after a major strike brought much of Germany's air traffic, rail service and commuter lines to a halt as workers demanded wage hikes in the face of brisk inflation. French police have come under severe criticism for heavy-handed tactics, and the IGPN, the Internal Affairs Unit of the French police, has launched 17 investigations into incidents since the pensions protests began.
The News International edition will now take a short break, but please stay with us.